Hello, people. Welcome back to Ask BirdGuy. I'm Matthew Daughter, the Executive Director of Santa Clara Valley Audubon Society, here to answer questions and just ramble on about whatever kinds of bird-related topics come to mind. Uh, right now, of course, we're in the middle of spring. It's beautiful. It's warm. We're stuck inside, um, and birds have arrived. Their spring migration is essentially come to a stop because they've arrived on their breeding grounds for the most part. We've got some Arctic breeders like phalaropes that are lingering here before they continue north. Um, and we've got a few late arrivals that might show up fairly soon but haven't gotten here quite yet. Woe to them. Fortune favors the punctual. And by now, some of the best nest sites have already been taken, especially if you're a species that nests in a cavity. Those cavities are prime properties, and they're taken, they're grabbed up pretty quickly. And then there are some habitually late arrivals, like western wood pewee and olive-sided flycatcher. They're here. They're setting up their nests. Overall, songs are being performed, territories are established, mates are chosen now, and the nesting begins. So, what kinds of nests are birds building, and who does what in that relationship? Will this relationship between nesting birds last beyond this spring? There's so many questions, and we could fill several episodes with the answers to those. We'll try to touch on some of them today. But I just wanted to point out one of the wonderful things about spring, of course, is the warmer temperatures. And because of that, we've got blooming flowers, we've got more insects, more obvious insects at least. And so it's no surprise then that this time of year, we see an abundance of insectivores, from flycatchers to warblers and what have you. So there's all kinds of insect protein out there for birds to feast on. And we know the importance of insects with nestlings, particularly caterpillars, for young birds. So when you go out, when you're looking around, just pay attention to how many species you see um, feeding on insects, searching for insects, and just watch their behavior and consider the number of seed-eating species that we see during the colder months. More sparrows, for example, I believe, probably during the winter months, and fewer of the insectivores. In any case, we'll answer a lot of questions this time, and we'll get started in a moment. So, as I said, the topic of bird's nest is it's a big topic, so it could take several videos to go through it all. And we'll just keep it real brief here. I wanted to point out that there are bunches of books available about bird nests. And my very favorite one is fairly recent. It's the Princeton Guide to Nests, Eggs, and Nestlings of North American Birds. I think it's wonderful. Not only does it have pretty thorough descriptions of each nest structure, number of eggs, placement, things like that. But it's also got these beautiful plates about not only about eggs that you might come across, but also some very adorable nestlings. So these are herons and egrets here. So that's a pretty great book. There's also the classic Peterson Guide to Bird's Nest, Western edition. And there are other books like Avian Architecture and Bird Nests. So these are all great just to talk about the structure, the architecture, the placement of nests, the importance of nests, why birds make the kinds of nests they do. I also want to point out one of my very favorite books, Birdwatcher's Companion, and it's got a really lengthy article about nests, different kinds of nests. And there's a pretty good illustration here showing a full spectrum of birds' nests. And there are a couple that it points out that I just want to bring to mind. There's the standard cup nest that you always imagine perhaps a robin might have. There's the cavity nest that bluebirds and Buick's friends will adopt. There's also masonry nests. These are the mud nests that cliff swallows make. There are burrows, like a burrowing owl might take to, or northern rough-winged swallow, or a belted kingfisher. There are depressions. For example, we can imagine black skimmers, least terns, taking just a simple scrape in the sand or the earth to lay their eggs in. There are stone nests, which I guess you can imagine a kilder might clear a couple of stones, make a place for its camouflaged eggs to sit. So anyway, tons of different kinds of nests, and it's quite fascinating to consider why it is that birds choose that structure, or why they have evolved to use that structure. So take a look at some of those resources. But finding a nest is a special thing, and it doesn't happen every day. They're supposed to be hidden. They're not supposed to be easy to find. So if you find a nest, you're really quite lucky. And I know offhand of a black phoebe nest that's at the ranch, so I get the chance to see that pretty regularly when I'm not stuck at home. But anyway, so that's a fairly common nest, and since the black phoebe is so vocal and usually pretty conspicuous, that's a nest that many people find pretty easily. So when it comes to nest duties, which partner is doing what in that nest structure, nest construction, nest attending. So what I always look at is how the birds, are they dimorphic? For example, black phoebes are identical in appearance, and California towhees are identical in their appearance. Dark-eyed juncos are very, very similar, but noticeably different. And then when you get to things like western tanager, hooded oriole, etc., you see much more of a chromatic dimorphism, the difference in color. And that indicates something pretty important about their responsibilities during the nesting season. Now, there are tons of exceptions and tons of specifics about the responsibilities of each mate in a pair, a nesting pair. But I'll say that the birds that look similar and really don't have dimorphism, like California towhees, have essentially equal duties with the nest, equally involved in the building and the attending of the young, the incubating, etc. So look to the pair of birds and ask yourself, do they look alike? Am I having a hard time telling them apart? And that's a pretty good indication that they share duties essentially equally. They may have slightly different responsibilities, but they're both attending the nest. They're both deeply involved. You look at juncos and their slight dimorphism, you can extrapolate from that there's probably more of a division of duties. Perhaps the female is attending the nest more. Maybe she's doing more of the incubation. And when you get to birds that are very different in appearance, western tanagers, hooded orioles, Anna's hummingbirds, we're going to see a big difference in the way they divide the duties of the nest and the young. The Anna's hummingbird, for example, the male has does not share in the duties at all. Doesn't feed the young, doesn't incubate, doesn't build the nest. That's all handled by the female. The male, in fact, tries to mate with multiple females, and he will choose essentially a lek, which would be a branch from which he can survey the area, defend a food source, and hopefully attract multiple females, hopefully mate with multiple females. So that's the extreme division of duties. And you could look to the plumage to kind of help you figure out what relationship you're looking at. So in this episode of Ask BirdGuy, The Ways of Birds, I thought it'd be fun to talk a little bit about how birds look, the way they look. And it's not a simple concept, but I want to go back just a little bit and talk about field guide representations of birds. So my very first field guide cost me $1, and it's ancient, but it did. When I lived in Boston, it worked just fine as a little boy. So I enjoyed it, but I quickly grew out of it. And the reason was because I was increasingly getting frustrated with the fact that birds just didn't look the way they did here in this book. They're fine illustrations, but there's just one illustration per species, and of course, not much detail. Birds change an awful lot, how they fluff up, how their feathers glide over each other, and it's important to understand how that topography works when you're trying to identify a bird, because a bird is not always going to look exactly like it does in the field guide. To put a point on that, I guess in 1983, the revised, expanded edition of the Golden Guide to Birds came out. This was a big deal at the time, but it was filled with, it had some issues still, despite all the efforts they went into to revise and expand it. Many advances were made, but still lots of things were wrong with it. So much to the point that the late Rich Stallcop wrote this book, Birds for Real, which is really quite wonderful if you can find it. It goes about describing how birds actually look in the field as opposed to how they are portrayed in the field guides. I like it quite a bit. I think it's kind of a collector's item now. I miss Rich. He was wonderful. I used to know him and met him several times. A giant in the bird world. But the reason this all came to mind is because recently I saw a blackbird with dark eyes, and I thought, well, gosh, it's not a brewer's blackbird because it doesn't have the pale yellow irises. It's got dark eyes, so it must be a red-winged blackbird. And yet I couldn't really see any red on the wings at all. It was a male. It was a glossy black. And what I realized, of course, was that it was a red-winged blackbird, but just that the red epaulets were hidden. These are the lesser coverts of the wing. Now, this pretty recent book does an excellent job of demonstrating that phenomenon. Here, you can see a red-winged blackbird, the way we normally consider it, and the way it looked to me on that day. So what that is those are the feathers from the back, the scapulars, that are kind of fluffing forward and covering up the red epaulets of the male. That happens when the bird is not agitated, not displaying. It happens an awful lot during the off-season. During breeding season, we see it less and less because the males really want to show off that brilliant red. That's a signal to their rivals and their potential mates. So the fact that birds look different could have to do with their mood, their attitude, what they're trying to express. Are they trying to express anything? And also the time of year. Do they want to advertise themselves? Do they want to show off? Are they trying to be territorial? So that was kind of an interesting realization there. That, and once again, it just points out the fact that the field guides fail in large degree because it's static. There's just this one stationary picture, or there could be multiple pictures, of course, or a photograph, an illustration, what have you. And aside from the complexities of lighting and artistic license, the birds don't always look exactly like they do in the field guide. So it's just really important to think about that when you're confronted with a bird you don't quite recognize. And I'm going to show you another example in a moment from Steve Zemek, who sent me this picture of what he thought he knew what it was, but he wasn't quite sure because one of the major field marks was hidden. So take a look at the picture and see what you think. So you'll see what looks like a flycatcher, but maybe it's not a flycatcher. Where are the wing bars? Why is it all fluffed up like that? So that picture really demonstrates exactly what I was talking about as far as the back feathers, the scapulars, kind of reaching forward and obscuring a field mark that we usually depend on. I feel that this is another Hammond's flycatcher due to the short dark bill and what looks to be long primary projection, and the overall color. But what's missing are the wing bars. So where the heck are they? It would be a pretty solid identification if we could see those wing bars, but we can't. It's just a stationary picture at this point, and we can't watch what happens an instant from now or just an instant before. But my guess is that those wing bars are there. They're just hidden by the scapulars that are fluffed forward and obscuring the wings. So watch the birds that you see. Watch the birds that you're unsure of. Watch for the feather arrangements to change. Watch for groups to slide over each other and reveal things that you didn't see a moment ago. So here's a funny thing that happens to one of our hawks, especially this time of year. So if you're walking in an open area and over the trees or over a field, you see a hawk with these long, exaggerated wing beats and a white patch on its rump, what would your first impulse be? What do you think that would be? Well, if you're thinking about typical field marks and field guides, that white rump would indicate a northern harrier, either male or a female or a young bird, depending on whether it's honey-colored or streaky brown or silvery gray. Let's say your bird is sort of nondescript. Maybe it's brownish, maybe slightly grayish. Who knows? But you see this white rump on it, and it looks like it has a longish tail, and the wing beats are kind of stiff and exaggerated, like that. So there's what's happening actually. It very likely is a Cooper's hawk. Cooper's hawk, and all accipiters for that matter, sharp-shinned goshawk, etc. They've got these fluffy white undertail coverts, and they puff up during the breeding season, during display. So when the birds are trying to attract a mate, or I suppose signal potential rivals in the area, they will go through. They'll engage in this display flight, which has these deep, very exaggerated, stiff wing beats, so kind of like a harrier, and then those fluffy white undertail coverts. They poof up around the outside, and then they wrap up around the sides of the bird at the base of the tail, and sometimes occasionally look like the entire rump is white. And I've seen this a number of times, and it always surprises me at first because never fail, my first guess is, oh, that's got to be a harrier. Look at that white rump. Anyway, it's just an example of how birds confound us with the way they look, the way their feathers slide over each other when they're puffed up or when they're flattened out, when they're agitated, when they're excited, when they're frightened, when they're curious. The bird feathers all over the animal have specific muscles that lift them up or flatten them down. And you think about the expressions that we have in our face and what we can do with our face. Well, birds can do much of that over their entire body with their feathers. So think about that. And I'm going to highlight a few books that actually help explain some of those peculiar things that happen with birds and their feathers. Really like this one, How Birds Work. It's brand new. I just got it a few days ago, and it's pretty wonderful. And if you recall, when I reviewed what it's like to be a bird, that was broken down by species or family groups, such as woodpeckers, blackbirds, sparrows, warblers, etc. And it's wonderful. Beautiful illustrations and lots of information. It's organized by family group, however. So if you want to, and several family groups exhibit what we might call structural color. Any birds that have blue, for example. So that could be a bluebird, it could be a jay, it could be even a warbler, it could be a number of things. You might find references to structural color in each of the entries about bluebirds, jays, and warblers. But if you want to learn a little bit more about structural color on its own, separate from a specific family group, I think this is a good book for you. It has a wonderful layout, and I'll just give you a kind of a preview here. variations in avian eyes. So that's kind of an interesting topic, and it talks about everything from the digestive system to the muscular system, skeletons, sense of smell, sense of vision, feathers, feather groups, how feathers evolved, eyesight, how underwater eyesight works. So it's pretty great. It's seems to have been written by an English author, so there's quite a few English species and European species in here, but no matter. We're talking about birds in general. So I really enjoyed this book. Two other books that I think are pretty great, and they may actually have been intended for beginners, but I really don't think that they are. Sibley's Birding Basics is a real small book, but it's filled with David Sibley's wonderful illustrations and his ability to explain complicated issues pretty clearly. So I recommend this one very highly. And a book that came out roughly the same time, National Geographic Birding Essentials, again, a pretty thin book. And it does much the same thing, except with photography and different topics. I think these are both pretty great. So the combination of these 4 books, Birding Essentials, should all go into your library.